Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we tackle big, complicated topics and really try to boil them down to the essential insights.
Mm-hmm.
You're here because you want to understand the world without getting, bogged down in endless information.
Exactly.
And that's what we aim to deliver, the crucial nuggets, those aha moments, really distilled from a stack of sources.
That's right. We know you're looking for depth, but, well, without the overwhelm. So we've sifted through a significant body of work here to bring you the core arguments and why they matter.
Today, we're diving deep into a book that really stirred up a hornet's nest when it came out. The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by John Mearheimer and Stephen Walt.
Oh, yeah.
Its impact was huge. Michael Massing, writing in the New York Review of Books, actually likened it to Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations.
Wow, that's quite a comparison.
It really is. It tells you this is a conversation with pretty serious implications.
It certainly did shake up the established thinking on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East.
So our goal today.
Well, our goal is to unpack the central claims of this book, look at the controversies it sparked, and, understand how the authors responded. We really want to equip you with a clear picture of what this pivotal work is all about.
Okay, let's get right into it then. One of maybe the most obvious aspects of the U.S.-Israel relationship is the foreign aid, just how much money flows from Washington to Jerusalem.
Yeah, the book flags this right away. It currently averages around $3 billion every single year.
$3 billion. Now, to put that in perspective for listeners, that's about 1/6 of the entire U.S. budget for direct foreign assistance.
Mm-hmm. And roughly 2% of Israel's own GDP, which is, substantial.
And how does that break down? Is it all cash?
Well, mostly not. Roughly 75%, three-quarters, is earmarked for military aid.
Okay.
The rest, that other quarter, is economic support. But here's a stat that might really make you pause.
So, Gore.
On a per-person basis, it works out to over $500 a year for every single Israeli citizen.
Wow. Over $500 per person. How does that compare?
We'll compare that to Egypt, the next largest recipient of U.S. aid. They get about $20 per person.
$20. That's a huge difference.
It is. And then look at countries facing, really dire economic situations. Like Pakistan, maybe $5 per person. Haiti, about $27, according to the figures in the book anyway.
So you see this massive disparity. It's really striking.
The authors also point out an interesting shift, sort of a change in how this aid is structured. Back in 1997, there was this agreement to gradually phase out the economic assistance.
Okay, so reduce the economic part.
Yeah, by about $120 million each year, starting in fiscal year 99.
But has that actually meant less money overall?
Well, here's where it gets interesting. That planned reduction in economic aid, it didn't really lead to an overall drop in U.S. support.
Why not?
Because at the same time, the U.S. committed to increasing military aid by $60 million annually.
Ah, okay. So decrease one, increase the other.
Exactly. And on top of that, Congress repeatedly added supplemental aid packages. The book mentions $1.2 billion linked to the Y agreement in 98. And another $1 billion in foreign military financing in 2003. Just as the U.S. was, heading into the Iraq War.
So it's like turning down one tap while opening others even wider.
Pretty much sums it up. And if you step back, look at the bigger picture. The sheer size of this aid, sustained over time, it's really quite unusual.
Because Israel isn't exactly a developing nation.
Far from it. The book emphasizes this. It's a modern, industrialized country, sophisticated economy. In 2006, its per capita income was 29th globally.
Higher than places like Portugal or South Korea.
Yeah, exactly. Ahead of countries like that, and Taiwan, too. That's a strong economic position.
And it's not just income, right? Quality of life indicators.
Also strong. The book cites the UN's Human Development Report. Israel ranked 23rd in 2006. And the Economist Intelligence Unit's Quality of Life Index put it at 38th in 2005.
So we're talking about a pretty prosperous nation receiving the lion's share of U.S. foreign aid, dwarfing what goes to countries facing real humanitarian crises. It definitely makes you wonder about the reasons behind it.
It certainly does. It raises that core question about the motivations, the justifications for this consistent, substantial support.
Did anyone acknowledge this weirdness?
Yeah, the book actually points out that even some prominent figures in the U.S. pro-Israel community, like Mitchell Bard and Daniel Pipes, they acknowledged this anomaly way back in 1997. They recognized Israel's strong economy.
Interesting. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Another really sensitive topic the book digs into is Israel's nuclear program. And the U.S. response, or maybe lack thereof sometimes.
Right. They paint a picture of a long history here, a lot of American unease, suspicion
Mhm.
about Israel pursuing nuclear weapons.
And how did Israel handle that scrutiny?
Well, what's revealing is the description of the tactics they apparently use to, well, manage and sometimes limit inspections.
Like what?
The book talks about instances where inspectors weren't allowed to bring all their own equipment or maybe couldn't take certain samples. A pattern, the authors note, you often see when nations are trying to keep proliferation efforts quiet.
Was the U.S. just passive about this?
Not entirely. According to the book, President Lyndon Johnson, LBJ, he was apparently ready to withhold American support if Israel didn't become more open about its nuclear plans.
But did he follow through?
Well, the book suggests that ultimately Johnson wasn't willing to push it to the point of a major break in the relationship. It was a delicate balance.
So what happened with inspections?
That tension led to a compromise. The initial idea was maybe semi-annual visits.
Twice a year.
Right. But Johnson apparently settled for roughly annual visits instead.
Okay.
And the book recounts this really pivotal moment in 1968. The CIA director at the time, Richard Helms, he told Johnson that U.S. intelligence had concluded Israel had nuclear weapons.
Wow. So the CIA confirmed it to the president.
That's the account. And Johnson's reaction, as the book describes it, is pretty significant for understanding the history here.
What did he do?
He reportedly told Helms to keep it quiet. Keep that information absolutely confidential. Don't even tell his own Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense.
Really?
Well, the journalist Seymour Hersh, whose account is cited in the book, suggests Johnson deliberately avoided formally acknowledging the intelligence because he knew if he did, he'd be forced to act on it.
Which he didn't want to do.
Apparently not at that stage.
Sure.
This historical context is really key, for understanding the kind of enduring ambiguity around Israel's nuclear status and the, well, often indirect approach the U.S. has taken.
Okay, so from nuclear ambiguity to diplomatic certainty at the UN, the book talks a lot about U.S. protection there.
It does. And the statistics they present are, well, pretty eye-opening. Between 1972 and 2006,
Yeah.
the United States used its veto power in the UN Security Council 42 times to block resolutions critical of Israel.
42 times. How does that compare?
Get this. That number is more than the total number of vetoes cast by all other Security Council members combined during that same time frame.
Seriously, more than all the others put together.
Yep. And it was over half of all U.S. vetoes ever cast up to that point. The authors really hammer home the sheer extent of this diplomatic shield.
And it wasn't just the actual vetoes cast, right?
No, exactly. The book points out there were lots of times when resolutions criticizing Israel never even got to a vote.
Because everyone knew the U.S. would veto.
The threat was just palpable. It was like an unspoken rule in the room.
Any specific examples?
They mention one from 2002. The U.S. ambassador to the UN then, John Negroponte, apparently announced that the U.S. would veto any resolution condemning Israel unless it also simultaneously condemned terrorism in general and specifically named groups like Islamic Jihad, Hamas, and the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade.
Setting a very high bar.
Extremely high. So while the U.S. did occasionally vote for resolutions that mildly censured Israel,
When did that happen?
usually only after, really egregious Israeli actions or if the resolutions themselves were very softly worded, it was also just a way for Washington to signal a bit of displeasure, but without really changing its fundamental support.
So this consistent pattern of diplomatic cover at the UN really highlights that close alignment.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially when Israel faces international criticism.
Okay, let's move on to the U.S. role in actual peace negotiations. Between Israel and its neighbors, the book argues the U.S. often protected Israeli interests there, too.
Yes, they give several examples. One they cite is Henry Kissinger's step-by-step diplomacy. That led to the 1975 Sinai, the second disengagement agreement between Israel and Egypt.
How did the U.S. protect Israel there?
Well, while the talks were complex, the U.S. played a role in making sure Israel's security concerns were met. This included, as the book notes, more military aid to Israel
Okay.
and a commitment to concerted action with Israel when planning any future peace conference. Think about that phrase, concerted action.
Yeah, acting together. What else?
Maybe even more significant for understanding the dynamics, the U.S. effectively gave Israel a veto over whether the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, could even participate in future peace talks.
How so?
Kissinger apparently promised, and this is detailed in the book, that the U.S. would not recognize or negotiate with the PLO until it formally recognized Israel's right to exist and accepted UN Resolutions 242 and 338.
And that stuck.
The authors emphasize that this pledge was later actually written into U.S. law, demonstrating a really long-standing policy.
So this history shows a consistent U.S. approach, prioritizing Israel's security needs as sort of a baseline for any peace efforts.
That's the argument the book puts forward, that those preconditions were fundamental.
All right, the book also tackles that argument you often hear that Israel was or is a vital strategic asset for the U.S., especially during the Cold War.
Yes, it acknowledges that argument.
Yeah.
There's definitely a case to be made that Israel helped counterbalance Soviet-backed states in the Middle East back then. Check their influence.
But the authors push back on that.
They do. They present some strong counter-arguments, suggesting that the strategic asset idea isn't quite so simple.
Like what?
Well, first, the significant economic costs. The deepening partnership with Israel cost the U.S. a lot of money. We touched on the aid figures earlier.
Right, the billions in aid.
And second, they question the actual capacity of Israel to be a major strategic asset for a superpower like the U.S. How much could it realistically do for its much larger partner?
Okay, cost and capacity. Anything else?
Yes, and here's where it gets really interesting. The book argues, somewhat paradoxically, that U.S. support for Israel might have actually helped push some Arab nations towards the Soviet Union in the first place.
How does that work? An unintended consequence.
Exactly. Think about countries like Egypt or Syria. They were in conflict with Israel. They couldn't get the support they wanted from Washington.
Because the U.S. backed Israel.
Right. Even though U.S. aid to Israel wasn't as massive in the early Cold War years, the basic commitment to Israel's security meant the U.S. was reluctant to give Egypt or Syria weapons they might use against Israel.
So they looked elsewhere.
The book suggests this lack of an alternative source of support ultimately drove them into Moscow's arms. It sort of backfired, in a way.
Okay, the book then connects U.S. support for Israel to America's standing in the world, and even terrorism. That's a heavy topic.
It is, and they point directly to the findings of the 9/11 Commission.
What did the commission find?
It confirmed that Osama bin Laden and other key al-Qaeda figures were significantly motivated by Israel's actions towards Palestinians and the unwavering U.S. backing for Israel. It wasn't just some minor issue for them. It was central.
And the book adds more detail.
Yeah, it highlights detail from the commission's staff reports suggesting bin Laden actually tried to speed up the date of the 9/11 attacks.
Why?
Following Ariel Sharon's controversial visit to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem in late 2000, bin Laden saw that as another major provocation, warranting a swift, severe response against the U.S. because of its support for Israel.
So the Palestinian issue was a core grievance.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about the timing. The book notes bin Laden's anger also influenced the targets chosen for 9/11.
Which one?
The original plans apparently included hitting the U.S. Capitol building. Why? Because it was seen as, and I quote the book, citing the report, the perceived source of U.S. policy in support of Israel.
Wow. Right at the heart of their motivation.
And beyond 9/11, the authors argue that this combination, consistent U.S. support for Israel, plus the ongoing occupation of Palestinian territories, has really damaged America's reputation in many parts of the world.
Making it harder to get cooperation on other issues.
That's the argument. Harder to get cooperation on things like counterterrorism or promoting democracy in the Middle East. It complicates broader U.S. foreign policy goals.
Did others see it this way? Diplomats. Israelis.
The book cites concerns from former diplomats, both British and American, warning that the Israel-Palestine conflict was poisoning relations between the West and the wider Islamic and Arab worlds.
Okay.
And even some prominent Israeli voices, like the veteran military correspondent Zev Schiff, apparently recognized that continuing the conflict and occupation would likely just fuel more terrorism. It wasn't just an outside view.
So it really underscores the potential costs, the negative consequences of that unwavering U.S. commitment, particularly regarding the conflict.
That's the case Mearheimer and Wolt make.
Another point the book raises, quite concerning, involves technology transfers and maybe a lack of transparency.
Yes. They present evidence suggesting Israel has, at times, transferred advanced U.S. technology to other countries.
Including potential U.S. adversaries.
That's the claim.
Yeah.
The book specifically mentions a 1992 report from the State Department's own Inspector General.
What did it say?
It indicated a systematic and growing pattern of unauthorized transfers by Israel, possibly starting as early as 1983. That's a serious breach of the agreements around providing that tech.
And it wasn't just the transfers themselves. There was an issue with an investigation.
Right. The book discusses a GAO Government Accountability Office investigation into something called the Doughton Affair. It was a big embezzlement scandal involving U.S. military aid funds.
And Israel didn't cooperate.
According to the GAO's findings, the Israeli government declined to fully cooperate. They wouldn't let U.S. investigators question Israeli personnel involved.
That lack of transparency, it raises questions about accountability, especially with U.S. taxpayer money involved.
It definitely leads you to think about the risks and complexities in such a close security relationship when transparency isn't always there.
Okay, the book then moves into some really fascinating historical territory, challenging some of the conventional wisdom about Israel's history.
Yes, they discuss the emergence of what's called the new history within Israel itself. Scholars there re-examining, often challenging, the established stories about the state's creation and its actions towards Palestinians and Arab neighbors.
What's the core challenge?
Well, what's particularly notable is the growing acknowledgement, even in Israeli academic circles, of a difficult truth.
Which is?
That while Jewish people undeniably faced horrific victimization in Europe, in the context of establishing Israel, they also sometimes acted in ways that caused the displacement and suffering of Palestinians.
A complex picture.
Very. The authors draw a parallel, maybe a controversial one, to the creation of the U.S. and Canada, which also involves significant harm and displacement of native populations. It's a tough comparison, but it's meant to make you think.
And the argument is that this new history isn't well understood in the U.S.
Exactly. The book argues this revised history hasn't really been acknowledged or widely grasped in America.
And the consequence of that.
This lack of awareness, they suggest, helps maintain the strong grip of the traditional moral justification for unwavering U.S. support. It shapes how many Americans see the conflict, perhaps simplifying it.
So a more nuanced history could lead to a more balanced understanding of the conflict's roots and complexities.
That seems to be the implication the authors are drawing.
Digging deeper into that history, the book looks at the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, specifically the power dynamics.
Right. It highlights that Israeli leaders back then were very aware of their growing military strength compared to the combined Arab forces.
They knew they were strong.
Apparently so. Yigal Yadin, a top Israeli military commander at the time, even claimed that if the British hadn't been there, they could have put down Arab unrest in just 1 month. That suggests real confidence.
Does the data back that up?
The book says yes. They cite the historian Benny Morris, whose research shows Israel actually had more troops on the ground throughout the 1948 war than the combined Arab armies.
More troops, really?
Consistently. By December 48, Israel had nearly 90,000 soldiers. And beyond numbers, Israel also gained a key advantage in weapons after the initial phase.
Plus organization?
Better organization, more effective command and control. These were crucial factors in their victory, even though the Arab states had much larger overall populations.
So the common narrative of a tiny, outgunned Israel fighting for survival, it needs some nuance.
That's what the book suggests. That narrative, while powerful, should be viewed alongside this historical context of Israel's actual military advantages at the time.
Okay, let's jump forward to the 1973 Yom Kippur War. The book challenges the idea that the Arab goal was Israel's destruction.
Right. It argues that Egypt and Syria actually had much more limited aims.
Which were
basically regaining the territory they lost in the 1967 Six-Day War, the Sinai Peninsula for Egypt and the Golan Heights for Syria, not destroying Israel itself.
Were they confident they could win?
The authors emphasized that the leaders in Cairo and Damascus knew it was incredibly risky to take on the IDF, the Israeli military.
They knew it was tough.
Yeah. General Hassan al-Badri, who helped plan the Egyptian attack, apparently said it almost seemed that success would be impossible, highlighting their awareness of the challenge.
And Benny Morris, the historian, is cited again.
Yes, quoted as pointing out that Israel's powerful military, probably including its unacknowledged nuclear weapons by then, likely deterred any serious Arab attempt to actually conquer and dismantle the state.
So the initial Arab attacks were successful, but limited in scope.
They gained ground initially due to surprise, yes, but the IDF eventually pushed back and regained the territory. The perspective here is to see the more limited strategic goals behind the Arab offensive.
Okay. The book also addresses moral conduct and human rights, a very difficult area.
Very. And it doesn't shy away from it. It references extensive documentation of Israeli actions by numerous human rights groups.
Including Israeli groups.
Yes, including several based within Israel itself. This isn't just criticism coming from the outside.
Any specific examples stand out?
They specifically highlight strong condemnation of Israel's conduct during the Second Intifada. This came from former high-ranking officials within Shin Bet, Israel's internal security agency.
Wow. What did they say?
One former official reportedly called Israel's behavior then disgraceful. Another labeled it patently immoral. Those are powerful critiques coming from within the security establishment.
The book also looks at the 2006 conflicts.
Yes, in Gaza and Lebanon. It details significant destruction of civilian infrastructure in Gaza and a high number of Palestinian civilian deaths.
Leading to international condemnation.
It led the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights at the time to declare a massive violation of human rights there.
And Lebanon in 2006.
Similarly, Israel's bombing campaign in response to the capture of 2 soldiers is described as causing widespread harm to Lebanese civilians and destroying vital infrastructure. Over 1,000 Lebanese deaths, mostly civilians.
And the author's take on that?
They argue this response was disproportionate, possibly violating laws of war. It directly challenges the narrative that Israel always acts with restraint.
It paints a very sobering picture of the human cost involved.
It does, and the book goes even further back historically into another sensitive area, the use of terrorism by some Zionist groups before Israel was created in 1948.
Pre-state terrorism.
Yes. It specifically mentions the Irgun, a Zionist paramilitary group. They introduced tactics like bombing crowded public places, buses, marketplaces in the late 1930s.
That's a disturbing claim.
It is. And Benny Morris, the historian, even speculates, as noted in the book, that some Arab groups might have learned about the effectiveness of terrorist bombings from these Zionist groups. A provocative thought.
And this continued.
Between 1944 and 47, several Zionist groups used terrorist attacks to pressure the British to leave Palestine, killing many civilians. The book also highlights the assassination of the UN mediator, Count Folke Bernadotte, in 1948.
Killed by Israeli extremists.
Yes, a direct attack on international peacemaking efforts.
What happened to those involved in these acts? Were they punished?
Well, this is striking. The book points out that the leaders of the plot to kill Bernadotte were eventually given amnesty by the Israeli government.
Amnesty?
Yes, and one was later elected to the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. Even Yitzhak Shamir, who later became prime minister, apparently approved of the assassination at the time and openly defended terrorism as a legitimate tool in their struggle.
That really challenges simple narratives about who uses terrorism and why.
It compels you to confront the reality that violence and tactics labeled as terrorism haven't been exclusive to one side in this long conflict. That's the book's point.
Okay, let's talk about peace offers being rejected. The book specifically looks at Yasser Arafat's role.
Yes, it tackles those persistent claims, especially around Camp David in 2000. It directly challenges the common idea that Arafat just flat out rejected Ehud Barak's peace offer there.
What's the counter-argument?
The book notes that negotiations actually continued for some time after the summit ended. It wasn't an immediate final rejection at Camp David itself.
And what about the Clinton parameters later that year?
The book also disputes the claim that Arafat outright rejected those proposals from President Clinton in December 2000.
How so?
And points out the official Palestinian response actually thanked Clinton, acknowledged progress, but also sought clarifications and expressed reservations on certain points.
Was that unusual? Did Israel accept them fully?
No, that's the key. The Palestinian response, with reservations, was actually quite similar to the reservations the Israeli government also had about the Clinton proposals. Neither side gave a simple yes.
So negotiations continued after that?
Yes, at the negotiator level, they continued at Taba in Egypt, until Prime Minister Barak broke them off in early 2001, right before Israeli elections.
So Barak ended the talks, not Arafat?
At that stage, yes. And subsequently, Ariel Sharon, who became the next prime minister, refused to resume those negotiations, despite Palestinian calls to do so.
So the book's conclusion on Arafat rejecting peace.
The authors conclude that the widely repeated charge that Arafat rejected a final golden opportunity isn't really supported by the full historical record when you look closely.
It encourages more nuanced view, moving beyond simple blame.
Exactly, considering all the factors that prevented a lasting deal.
The book also brings in another dimension, Christian Zionism, its influence on American views and policy.
Right. It describes this core belief among many evangelical Christians that modern Israel's founding is a direct fulfillment of biblical prophecy.
The idea of God promising the land to Abraham.
Precisely, an everlasting inheritance. And this theological view leads some Christian Zionists to see Israeli settlements in the West Bank not as illegal or obstacles to peace.
But as what?
As divinely sanctioned, reclaiming land promised in the Bible. Furthermore, many in this movement see a greater Israel as a crucial step towards the end times events described in the Bible.
And this has political consequences.
Big ones. The book notes a big increase in political engagement by dispensationalist Christians, a key group within Christian Zionism, especially after the 1967 Six-Day War.
Why then?
They saw Israel capturing Jerusalem and the West Bank as clear signs that biblical prophecies were happening right now. That really galvanized their support for Israel and their desire for the U.S. government to actively back Israeli policies.
It adds a whole other layer to understanding the depth of support for Israel in parts of American society.
A significant and sometimes overlooked layer, yes, affecting U.S. foreign policy.
Okay, now let's turn directly to the lobby itself, the subject of the book's title, starting with AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee.
Right. The book emphasizes AIPAC's widely acknowledged reputation. It's seen as the most powerful, most effective pro-Israel lobby in the U.S.
Is there evidence for that claim? Rankings?
Yeah, back in 1997, Fortune magazine ranked the most powerful lobbies in D.C. AIPAC came in second.
Second only to who?
Only to the ARP. Ahead of huge groups like the AFL-CIO Union, even the NRA.
Wow.
Right.
Any other rankings?
A similar study by the National Journal in 2005 reached a similar conclusion. It really underscores AIPAC's perceived clout.
What do politicians say?
The book quotes several. Former Congressman Mervyn Dimely called AIPAC, without question, the most effective lobby. Lee Hamilton, former chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, said, "There's no lobby group that matches it. They're in a class by themselves."
High praise in terms of effectiveness.
Definitely. And the authors also point out how changes in campaign finance rules in the 80s, allowing more independent PACs, political action committees.
That helped AIPAC.
It amplified their political leverage, their ability to influence elections.
It seems clear AIPAC is seen as a major force in Washington.
A formidable one, yes. But it's important to understand, the book stresses this too, that the entire pro-Israel lobby isn't just one single voice. It's not monolithic.
There's diversity within it. Different views.
Absolutely. While groups like AIPAC and the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations often lean towards the more hardline parties in Israel, and were skeptical of the Oslo peace process.
There are other groups.
Yes, other significant Jewish organizations in the U.S., like Americans for Peace Now or the Israel Policy Forum. They strongly push for a two-state solution. They believe Israel needs to make real concessions for peace.
So there's internal debate.
A crucial internal debate. The book even gives a historical example. An organization called Brera in the 70s faced a huge backlash just for talking with PLO representatives.
Just for talking.
Yeah. It shows the strong pressure sometimes within the community against engaging with those seen as Israel's adversaries.
The book also connects the lobby to the neoconservative movement. How does that work?
Well, it notes that many prominent neoconservatives are Jewish intellectuals and activists, but it also makes clear neoconservatism isn't exclusively Jewish. There are influential non-Jewish figures too. It's nuanced.
And the connection to the lobby.
The authors argue that, in many ways, neoconservatism is like a microcosm of the broader pro-Israel movement. Jewish Americans are central to both, but both also include non-Jews who share that strong commitment to Israeli security and a specific vision for U.S. policy in the region.
And their policy goals align.
That's the key point. The neoconservative agenda, strong American power, unwavering support for Israel, often aligns very closely with the goals of the more hawkish parts of the Israel lobby.
Even if most American Jews don't identify as neoconservatives politically.
Exactly. Even if the broader political views of most American Jews might lean differently, this specific policy alignment on Israel and the Middle East is significant. It's a fascinating intersection of interests.
And the book argues this convergence has really shaped U.S. policy over the decades.
Been a significant factor, yes.
Let's talk about the lobby's influence on elections. Is there a perception that crossing AIPAC is risky for politicians?
The book suggests that perception is widespread, that taking positions critical of Israel or going against AIPAC's wishes could hurt you electorally.
How do they illustrate that?
There's a striking analogy used. Voting against Israel has become like voting against lumber in Washington state, except AIPAC does it all over the country.
Meaning it's politically damaging almost anywhere.
That's the implication. The book quotes Morris Hamate, a former AIPAC director, saying everyone seems to be very good nowadays, suggesting politicians are towing the line.
And Jimmy Carter.
Former President Carter observed it's almost politically suicidal for a member of Congress to take what he saw as a balanced position on the Israel-Palestine issue. Strong words about the perceived pressure.
So this fear of electoral backlash can really shape how politicians vote and what positions they take on Israel-related issues.
That's the argument. It influences policy outcomes.
What about media coverage? Does the book see bias there?
It observes a generally pro-Israel leaning among many prominent columnists at major papers like the New York Times and the Washington Post.
So more pro-Israel columns than critical ones.
While you do see occasional columns critical of specific Israeli policies, the authors note a relative lack of consistent pro-Palestinian voices getting those prominent platforms. This shapes the narrative reaching many Americans.
The book also touches on fear and accusations of anti-Semitism.
Yes. It highlights a heightened sense of anxiety, maybe vulnerability, among many American Jews when Israel faces intense criticism.
How does that manifest?
Examples of strong emotional reactions, sometimes using Holocaust imagery in response to criticism of Israeli policies.
And the anti-Semitism charge.
The book discusses the tendency to label critics of Israeli government policies as anti-Semitic. It mentions a specific paper from the American Jewish Committee by Alvin Rosenfeld.
What did it claim?
Controversially, it accused even some liberal American Jews who criticized Israel of taking part in a new anti-Semitism.
That sounds like it could stifle debate.
Exactly. The book suggests this tactic can serve to shut down open, critical analysis of Israeli government actions by raising the specter of anti-Semitism.
So the lobby's agenda isn't just about aid money?
The book argues it goes well beyond that. It includes actively trying to shape the whole Middle East environment in ways that benefit Israel's security interests.
How?
Often, this means supporting Israel and its conflict with the Palestinians, and pushing for assertive U.S. action against other regional players, states, or movements seen as hostile to Israel.
And not much support for pressuring Israel.
The book points out a general lack of significant support within the lobby for the U.S. adopting a more even-handed approach, or putting serious pressure on Israel to make concessions for peace.
So the goal is a regional context favorable to Israel's long-term needs.
That's how the book portrays the lobby's broader strategic agenda, influencing U.S. policy in many ways.
Okay, let's look at specific examples of influence during the Bush administration. The book mentions a humiliation of Bush.
Yes, in 2002, President Bush publicly called for Israel to withdraw its forces from Palestinian cities during Operation Defensive Shield. A clear demand from the White House.
But it didn't work.
Despite Bush's call, the lobby successfully rallied support in Congress to give Israel extra military aid, directly contradicting the president's stated policy at that moment.
What about the roadmap peace plan?
The book argues that Prime Minister Sharon at the time had no real intention of negotiating an independent Palestinian state, even though he paid lip service to the roadmap.
And the lobby's role.
Their influence, the authors suggest, contributed to the lack of any real U.S. pressure on Israel to actually move forward with those negotiations. The impasse continued.
And the 2006 Lebanon War.
Also presented as a case where the U.S., heavily influenced by the lobby, gave a kind of tacit green light and unwavering support, diplomatic and military, for Israel's actions.
Any quotes supporting that view?
The book quotes Brent Scowcroft, a former national security advisor, saying Sharon had President Bush wrapped around his little finger, suggesting very strong influence.
So these examples together suggest significant lobby influence on key Bush-era Middle East policies.
That's the case the book lays out.
Now, the Iraq War. This is a really controversial claim in the book, that the lobby was a factor in the decision to invade.
Yes, a very controversial argument. They suggest pressure from Israel, and the lobby was a critical element, not the only factor, they stress, but a critical one in the decision to attack Iraq in 2003.
What's the link they draw? Israel's concerns about Iraq.
They highlight Israel's long-standing worry about Iraq, especially its past nuclear program. Remember, Israel bombed the Osirak reactor back in 1981?
Right.
And they point out that Ariel Sharon, even in 2001, apparently saw Saddam Hussein's Iraq as a bigger, more immediate threat than Iran at that time.
And the role of neoconservatives in the Bush administration.
The book emphasizes their role. Many had close ties to the pro-Israel lobby and were strong advocates for regime change in Iraq. They pushed hard for the Iraq Liberation Act back in 1998.
Anyone else mentioned?
They also mentioned Ahmed Chalabi, the Iraqi exile leader who got a lot of support from neocons. He reportedly made promises to the lobby about future Israel-Iraq relations, even an oil pipeline, if they backed him.
And after the war went badly.
The authors note subsequent efforts by some to sort of downplay or dismiss the idea that Israeli or lobby influence played any significant part in the disastrous outcome.
Okay, what about Syria? Did the lobby influence policy there too?
The book argues yes, that the lobby pushed for a tougher, more confrontational U.S. stance towards Damascus than the Bush administration might have taken otherwise.
Yeah.
They cite the passage of the Syria Accountability Act in 2003, which put sanctions on Syria as an example of the lobby's success.
And neoconservatives again?
Yes, neoconservatives in the U.S., often aligned with the lobby's hawkish views, kept calling for stronger action, even military intervention, against Assad's regime. Especially during the 2006 Lebanon War, it fit the pattern of weakening Israel's perceived adversaries.
All right, let's turn to Iran, another major focus. The book acknowledges the shared U.S. concern about Iran getting nukes.
Yes, it acknowledges that shared interest, but it highlights the particularly intense Israeli and lobby view that a nuclear Iran cannot be contained or deterred.
They believe Iran might actually use nuclear weapons.
That's the fear expressed, that they might use them against Israel or maybe U.S. interests. This deep fear drives a very hard-line position, demanding prevention, not just containment.
Did Iran ever offer to talk?
The authors point out that Iran actually made overtures for engagement with the U.S. in the past, including offers to negotiate its nuclear program, maybe even explored a way to coexist with Israel, a modus vivendi.
But those talks didn't happen.
The book argues the lobby was largely successful in stopping both the Clinton and Bush administrations from seriously pursuing those diplomatic openings, leading to a more consistently confrontational U.S. approach.
An approach the authors feel hasn't worked well.
That's their assessment, that the hardline approach hasn't necessarily achieved the desired results and maybe closed off potentially useful diplomatic paths.
The book also looks back at the Clinton administration and its dual containment policy against both Iran and Iraq.
Right. The authors note Israeli leaders like Rabin and Peres started emphasizing the Iran threat right after the Cold War ended.
Why then?
The book suggests it was partly an effort to build closer U.S.-Israel strategic ties in the new post-Soviet world, finding a new shared threat, perhaps.
Did Clinton embrace dual containment right away?
Initially, the administration had reservations, but eventually it became a key part of their Middle East policy.
And lobby influence here too.
The book details significant pressure from the lobby, including figures like Edgar Bronfman Sr. and AIPAC itself, that killed a proposed oil deal between the U.S. company Conoco and Iran in 1993.
So they could influence economic policy too if it involved perceived adversaries.
That example illustrates their reach, yes.
After the Iraq invasion removed Saddam, did the focus shift fully to Iran?
The book describes continued, even stronger, Israeli pressure on the U.S. to confront Iran, including calls for regime change in Tehran. Shimon Peres wrote an op-ed in 2003 stressing the urgency of stopping Iran's nuclear program.
Did the U.S. impose maximum sanctions?
While sanctions were significant, the book notes U.S. reluctance sometimes to go even harsher, partly due to worries about upsetting European and Asian allies with strong economic ties to Iran.
And relations with Arab states. Did U.S. support for Israel hinder cooperation against Iran?
The authors argue, yes, that the strong U.S. backing for Israel sometimes limited Washington's ability to effectively work with Arab states to counter Iran.
And the Iranian diplomatic offer in 2003?
Right. The book reminds us of that outreach under President Khatami, offering big concessions on the nuclear program, terrorism, helping in Iraq in return for normal relations with the U.S., an offer that didn't get traction in Washington at the time.
So the book ends by suggesting alternatives, like offshore balancing.
Yes, it considers returning to that traditional U.S. strategy in the Middle East, used during much of the Cold War.
What does that involve?
Basically maintaining a regional balance of power without getting directly involved in occupations or trying to impose democracy from afar. Supporting different sides at different times to maintain equilibrium, like tilting towards Iraq against Iran in the 80s, then intervening against Iraq in 1990.
And the book suggests the U.S. can pressure Israel if it wants to.
It argues the U.S. has historically been willing and able to put significant pressure on Israel when its own interests demanded it. The key example is after the 1956 Suez Crisis.
What happened then?
The Eisenhower administration basically forced Israel to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula despite Israeli resistance. It shows the U.S. has leverage when it chooses to use it.
But would Israeli public opinion accept concessions for peace now?
Well, the book points to polls from around 2007 showing relatively low Israeli public support for some key elements needed for a two-state deal, like the ones in the Clinton parameters.
Meaning pressure would be needed?
It suggests any U.S. president trying to broker that kind of deal would likely need to exert considerable diplomatic pressure on the Israeli government to overcome domestic resistance.
And finally, the book proposes campaign finance reform as a way to reduce the lobby's influence.
Yes, specifically public financing of elections. They argue this could weaken the direct link between lobby funding and elected officials,
Leading to more open debate.
potentially creating an environment where U.S. policy towards Israel could be discussed more openly, more robustly, without politicians fearing the same level of electoral consequences. That's the hope expressed.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Israel lobby and U.S. foreign policy, it's clear this book presents a really powerful and, yeah, often debated perspective.
Definitely.
The authors build this detailed case about the lobby's significant role, influencing aid, diplomacy at the UN, even controversially the Iraq war decision.
Absolutely. It's a comprehensive, often challenging analysis, uses a lot of sources, and it's really designed to make you, the listener, think critically about all the dynamics involved here.
Understanding these arguments, the criticisms against them, the history, it seems essential for really getting a handle on the U.S.-Israel relationship.
Couldn't agree more. It's vital context for anyone trying to understand this complex and enduring relationship.
And that brings us to our final thought for you today. After hearing all this, considering the arguments from the book, what do you now think are the most critical factors shaping U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East right now?
And maybe what might be the long-term consequences of the dynamics we've discussed today? Something to ponder.
Definitely something to think about as you continue to explore these really important issues and, form your own informed opinions. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.